Welcome to lesson 3 of Journey of the Soul. This evening's class is titled The Mourning After. That's M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. And we are in your student book. We are on page 83. By the way, on that note, if there's anyone who does not have a student book, I have one extra one. Thank you to those who returned when they had 2, even though some of you, your registration even included 2 of them. Because you registered as a couple, but you said 1 is enough. If anybody is missing a textbook, please feel free to let me know. I will make sure to get this to you ASAP. I think, though, at this point, everyone has one. Okay. Lesson 3, of course, is going to pick up after everything we discussed in lesson 1 and lesson 2. So as a reminder, in lesson 1, we spoke about why we shouldn't fear death, how we can be immortal, how we can recognize that our lives are more about our soul than they are about our body. And the more we choose to focus on that, the less changes when we pass. In lesson 2, we spoke a lot about the evolving relationship with the deceased. So as they pass, how the soul slowly and gradually leaves the body, and what is our ongoing relationship with our loved ones after they pass away. So we spoke about grave visitation, and we spoke a little bit. We haven't fully touched yet on yard sites and Kaddish and those things. So we're really going to talk mainly about them next week. Today's class is going to be focused primarily on the grief aspect, the grief, the mourning, the feelings that are left. So we're kind of pivoting a little bit. Till now, we've been discussing the human being as they are when they pass, right? And again, everybody looks at this from different angles. I know at the beginning of this course, we did a lot of discussing about why you're here. And some people were here because of feelings that they have about their own mortality. And other people were here because of loved ones that passed on, that they want to understand that dynamic. Today, we're pivoting from talking about from first person perspective, right? The person who's passing and my life and my body and soul, etc. And we're gonna talk about those that are left behind after someone passes away. So the close family, the friends that we're gonna talk a lot about shiva and consoling those that have those that passed. What is the proper Jewish perspective on grief and on mourning and on kind of, first of all, the beginning stages of it, when we shouldn't be coming out of it, and then how we slowly do come out of it, etc. We're going to do some contrasting between modern psychology and the Torah perspective. A lot of exciting stuff today. But I want to start by sharing a story. There is a man, I don't know if a man so much as a legend. Raise your hand if the name Blondin is familiar to you. So Charles Blondin was his stage name. I see some people raise their hands and some are like half-half. Charles Blondin was his stage name. His French name was Charles, I don't know, je ne sais quoi, I don't know, something else. I think it ended with an A, like, you know, E-T in French. In any event, he was, I don't know if he was the first person to cross Niagara Falls on a tightrope. He certainly did it many times throughout his life. I think over 300 times. This was kind of his shtick, and he was so synonymous with tightrope walking that for the next 100 years, the act of tightrope walking, even when done at a circus or in a stage set, was called Blondin. It was called, that was like the name of the act was called to do a Blondin or what have you. And they tell the story about Charles Blondin that one time they stretched a tightrope over Niagara Falls, and I guess he walked across it once, and there were some people that were there that believed that he could do it, and other people that believed that he couldn't. In any event, he walked across it once, and then he decided he's going to entertain the crowd. So he tells them, "Who thinks I can walk back?" And so everybody says, "We believe, we believe, we believe," right? And so he says, "Who thinks I can do it without this stick?" Right? If you've ever seen a tightrope walker, they have these balancing sticks they hold in their hands. He says, "Who thinks I can do it without this stick?" So everybody says, "We believe, we believe, we believe." He says, who thinks I can do it blindfolded?" The crowd is chanting and they're excited. "We believe, we believe." "Who thinks I can walk across the tightrope blindfolded while wheeling?" And he picks up a big wheelbarrow. "While wheeling this wheelbarrow." And they look at him and they say, "We believe, we believe, we believe." And so he says, "Who thinks I can walk across the tightrope blindfolded with this wheelbarrow and a person inside of it?" And the crowd goes, crazy, you know, "We believe, we believe, we believe." He waits till it quiets down, and then he goes, "I need a volunteer." And he's met with silence. right? Very often, we find ourselves in our lifetimes faced with a lot of things we believe, and by the way, we truly do believe them. There's a lot of theory. There's a lot, there's a lot in our minds that's very practical, very theoretical, and it makes sense to us, and it's philosophical, and the whole thing works. But then when it comes down to the practical, it just doesn't add up. And sometimes we view that as hypocritical. I'm not sure that's necessarily the right way of looking at it. Sometimes it's just hard for us to translate from the philosophical into the emotional or into the practical. And tonight's lesson, we're gonna dive right into the practical. In other words, it's very nice for us to sit here, even if we have lost loved ones recently, and even if we're still struggling with that. The fact is that when we come to this classroom, it's more of an intellectual setting. We sit here and we pontificate and we think about it. And I want to try to pivot from that. I want to try to make this very practical and to talk about, so does that mean, because we believe, for instance, that the soul is immortal and that the body isn't really, right, doesn't really add up to much, does that mean that we shouldn't cry after a loved one passes away because they've gone on to a better place? That's what I want to start today's class talking about. And we're going to open with two texts. And in these two texts, one of which is from a book called The Other Side of Sadness, What the New Science of Bereavement Tells Us About Life After Loss. And another one is a New York Times article. They are text 1 and 2. And we will read them respectively, both gripping tales, but two tales of two different people and how they deal with loss. They start on page 84. Esther, can I ask you to read text 1? Go for it.
Yes, of course. Heather Lindquist was in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when she heard a dull thud. It sounded as if it came from the hallway, and it was just a little too loud to ignore. "Boys," she yelled, "what are you up to?" There was no answer. She found her two boys playing quietly on the couch in the living room. They giggled. "You jokers," she said with a smile. "What was that sound?" They shrugged. "Where is your father?" Without waiting for an answer, she ran toward the hallway. She cried out in fear when she found her husband, John, writhing on the floor. John had severe asthma. He was taking a new medication and it had seemed to be working, but suddenly he had collapsed in the worst attack he'd ever had. Heather tried everything she could think of to save her husband's life. Then she called an ambulance. The rest was a blur. John died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. Heather was 34 years old. Her boys were 5 and 7. At that moment, John's death felt like the worst thing that could ever have happened to her. Heather Lindquist had lived her entire life in the same quiet suburban community in northern New Jersey. She and John had been high school sweethearts. They married and purchased a small ranch-style house. They had children. They got a dog. The schools were good and the community was stable. Heather thought that the television was on more than it should be, but other than that, everything seemed in order. Then John died and she had to rethink it all. Now she was a single parent. She had to find new ways to earn money and also find extra time to be with her boys. And somehow she had to contain everyone's anguish. She found strength she didn't know she had. It was lonely and painful at times, but Heather found meaning and vigor and even joy in the idea that she was going to make. I expected to collapse. I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do, Heather explained. But I couldn't. Each day I got up and did what I had to do, did what I had to. The days passed and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course. We all were. They hung in there and we stayed together. I loved those boys so much. John would have been proud of them.
Thank you, Esther. You know, I read this already before while I was preparing the class, and it was a hard read the first time, if you're actually feeling, you know, what Heather is going through. And it certainly, and it hasn't gotten any easier as I hear it again. But this is Heather's reaction. This is Heather's story. These are both true stories. Ron, can you please read to us Stephanie's story? Text 2. This is a New York Times article.
In 2004, Stephanie Mulberg of Short Hills, New Jersey, lost her son Eric, 13, to Ewing's sarcoma, a bone cancer. 4 years after Eric's death, Ms. Muldberg, now 48, walked around like a zombie. I felt guilty all the time, guilty about living, she said. I couldn't walk into the deli because Eric couldn't go there any longer. I couldn't play golf because Eric couldn't play golf. My life was a mess. And I couldn't talk to my friends about it because after a while they didn't want to hear about it. Stephanie, you need to get your life back, they'd say, but how could I? On birthdays, I'd shut the door and take the phone off the hook. Eric couldn't have any more birthdays. Why should I?
Thank you, Ron. I can see a lot of you thinking. And if you don't mind, I'd love to hear what you're thinking about. We have here 2 stories, Heather and Stephanie. Each of them reacted differently to their loss. And I guess my question is one response healthier or better, so to speak, than the other? And of course, we have right away the questions, right? Is Heather in denial because she managed to move on after her husband passed? Is Stephanie overreacting because she seems to never be able to move on? Why did they react differently? What do you guys think? Here's some thoughts.
I have personal experience with the second one, with my parents. I lost my brother very tragically, and my mother and my father were thunderstruck by that for a great deal of time. And I think that it's losing a spouse is much different than losing a child.
Okay.
It
Thank you.
carries with it a very different sorrow.
100%. And that's a very valid point. I'd like to add a few more points to that, but let's see what else we have here. Go ahead, Mickey.
Well, one thing that stands out to me between these 2 tragic incidences is in the case of Heather, she had 2 young boys who really needed her to be responsible.
Here we go. There's our psychologist.
Yeah,
Thank
right.
you.
Rise to the occasion, so to speak. Well, it doesn't go into further details about Stephanie.
Correct.
Whether there was others that she really had to take care of, a husband or other kids or anything like that, or she was left alone.
And if I understand you correctly, you're saying that when you have someone to care for, you're kind of forced to move on, right?
Yes, you have that responsibility that is there, and that really motivates you. It doesn't make your grief any less or any less painful, but you have other things that you got to have to answer the call to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else want to chime in here? Go ahead, Laura. Oh, I'm sorry. I muted you right after you unmuted. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it's just a comment. I noticed that in Stephanie's story, she was saying, I don't want to go to the deli because Eric can't go, or I don't want to celebrate birthdays because Eric can't have any more birthdays. And I personally did not relate to that. I found it a little confusing. I felt like, I could definitely understand being very depressed and not feeling motivated to do anything. I've experienced grief, and I felt like I don't want to go anywhere or do anything. I don't even have the energy to talk to somebody on the telephone. I just want to be in bed. But I was perplexed by her thought process, where she was attributing it to the fact that her son was no longer able to. I felt like, what does that have to do with you? Like, I don't know.
Absolutely.
I'll say this thing, but I don't get it personally.
We're going to talk a little bit later today about something that's called survivor's guilt. You're very lucky, Baruch Hashem, that you didn't experience that. And I really hope that no one on this Zoom has, because it's a very, very difficult thing to deal with. Where you feel the entire time that you're alive is something you have to feel ashamed of, because if that person can't be alive, you shouldn't be alive. And I'm very happy to hear that you didn't experience that, but there are people who do. Esther Necha, you want to share something? And then we'll cut it off there. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to talk about exactly what you were saying when you said she didn't relate to it. Stephanie feels like she has no right to live because her son is not living, and she's punishing herself for being alive when her son is not.
100%. And that's and like I said, it's something we're going to talk about later in the lesson as well. So we'll leave it for now. But these are some very, very good points being made. I think that all of you are really making one point, which is a very good point to be making, which is let's not judge. Okay, the textbook gives 2 suggestions, which obviously are meant to be, that we shouldn't take those suggestions. Is Heather in denial, and is Stephanie overreacting? The answer really is that every person grieves differently, and there isn't a correct or an incorrect way to grieve. These are our emotions, and we're going to be talking about them throughout the next hour and change. But most importantly, it's not for us to judge. Some of you pointed out some of the differences, and I'll point out some more, by the way. Mickey pointed out that one of them had other people needed to rely on them, and the other one, at least to the best of our knowledge, doesn't. Someone else pointed out that who was first? Sorry, I can't remember who it was. Who went first? Raise your hand. I forgot.
Ron was.
Sorry, Ron, yeah. So Ron pointed out that there's a difference between who it is that you lose, whether it's your child or a parent, right? We have these notions in our head, and for good reason. And naturally, parents should go before the children. Parents should never need to bury children, etc. And I'll point out some more, by the way. Nobody pointed out that Heather's husband seems to have died like this, suddenly, without any warning. And Stephanie's son seems to have been battling a long battle where he slowly went. And those can go either direction, by the way. I'm not saying that it goes one way or the other. Sometimes when somebody dies suddenly, of course it's a shock, but at least that person didn't have to go, the loved one didn't go through the pain of watching them slowly disappear. I know there's someone who's going to watch this recording after tonight's class. I know he can't make it on Mondays, but he's been watching each recording, and he shared with me, sent me a text message that he has I think it was his mother, who had dementia for many, many years before she passed away, and how painful it was for him to watch her and think to himself, so is her life over already? Is it not over? Did her soul already leave the body? I mean, she didn't die, but yet, right, we all know that dementia is a terrible, terrible illness. And so sometimes that's good. When someone has an illness, it gives us, that time to prepare, etc. Oh, this is coming, and psychologically it gives us time to get on board with them. And sometimes that's terrible to watch them go through all that and watch them suffer, especially if it's for many years. So I don't think, and this is kind of the tone that I want to set before the lesson, I don't think it's ever our place to judge how someone grieves. No matter what it is that's going on, there is never a correct or an incorrect way. And that being said, we will try to set a framework for it, or to understand what the Torah's framework for it is. Even though no 2 people are alike and no 2 circumstances are the same, we're going to try to give a general framework that, again, nobody can be blamed for stepping out of that or doing that or not doing that or doing more than that or doing less than that, but a general framework for how we grieve and of course how to emerge from that back into regular life. Okay, and so that is tonight's lesson in a nutshell. We're going to go through 3 points. Number 1, we're going to talk about, of course, the Torah view of mourning and grief, and we're going to contrast that versus secular perspectives on these things, both ancient and modern. We're going to talk about, and we're definitely not going to do this subject justice, and I'll talk more about it when we get there. Torah principles. Notice how there's no Torah view. We'll try to gain some insight from the Torah on dealing with chronic grief, which means that when someone cannot get out of their grief and it's clearly getting to a debilitating stage. And then, of course, we'll talk about, for those that are not grieving, but are visiting those that are grieving, right? The third party, right? So in this lesson, we've started off from going from the first party, the deceased, to the second party, the loved one who was grieving for the deceased. And then at the end of today's lesson, we'll spend about 20 minutes talking about the third party, those that visit the loved one of the deceased, and some etiquette on what we do in a shiva house, etc. Okay. Sorry, somebody wants to say something? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so let's dive into our text. And we open with a non-Jewish perspective on grief. And that is from the famous Socrates. Okay, so Socrates, for those of you that are not familiar, was a little bit of a rebel in his time. He had an annoying little habit of whatever you would say, he would say, but maybe it's the opposite. And this is the way he went about his life. He was a philosopher, of course. And Socrates eventually, because he challenged everything that was the norm in those days, got himself arrested and sentenced to death, without getting into all the details of the story. And we have a very interesting accounting that's passed down to us of Socrates' is that how you say it? Discussion or conversation with some of his disciples, some of his students, namely Phaedo, Cebes, and Evenise, and that is text 3. Esther Nacha, can I ask you to read it for us, please?
Yes.
No.
Oh, okay. I'm not
you're
muted.
good. Go ahead.
Socrates instructed. Cebes, please relate the following message to Evenus and bid him be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come after me by immediately leaving this world, if he be a wise man and not tarry, and that today I am likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must. Simmias said, what a message for such a man. Having been a frequent companion of his, I should say that as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he is obliged. Why, said Socrates, not even as a philosopher?
No,
Why is not even as a philosopher?
There you go.
I think that he is, says Simmias. Then he, or any man who has a spirit of philosophy, will be willing to die, but he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. The day may come when you will understand why, though a man is better dead, he is not permitted to be his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another.
Thank you, Esther Necha. Socrates' perspective represents the philosopher's view from ancient times up until very recently, that suicide is not allowed, right? And suicide is considered being a benefactor, you understand? Being your own benefactor. If someone kills you, they're doing you well, but death is to be embraced, and death is an amazing thing. In other words, murder, and even including murdering yourself, is not allowed according to philosophers. However, should you die, and should even someone kill you, that's a great thing, and is an amazing, and should be celebrated and should be happy. Now, I should mention that a lot of you are probably thinking that Socrates is, all talk. He's going to die. He was sentenced to death already, and so of course he's going to say that death is better than life, and he's going to try to go with that. And I will point out that according to many opinions, many historical accounts that we have of that time, Socrates' disciples actually secured, either by bribing the guards or whatever it was, they figured out a way for him to be able to escape. And he casually said, no, thank you. In other words, he was a man of his word. He really believed that it was better to be dead than to be alive. By the way, just to give some background, the ancient philosophers believed in the soul, perhaps not the Jewish concept of the soul, but they believed in a soul, and that living as a soul was better than living in a body. Why they didn't believe in suicide is a whole different discussion. And this is not the Jewish view at all, despite the fact that over the past couple of weeks we've mentioned the immortality of the soul, and the fact that the soul lives on forever, and that really even during our lifetime we should be much more in tune with our soul than with our body. Still, the Jewish perspective is that when a person dies, there is a lot to mourn. Mickey, if I can ask you please to read for us text 4. Mickey? There you go.
Or we are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin.
Thank you. So this is Maimonides taking the approach. Maimonides is the most famous, Jewish codifier of law, and he takes the approach that it is halacha, Jewish law, that a person, and not just Jewish law, but based on a biblical mitzvah commandment that we have to mourn for those that have passed away, our next of kin. And according to other opinions, it's rabbinic, but according to the Rambam, certainly it's biblical. And this begs the question, why? We have spoken a lot about the fact that there's a lot to celebrate, right? A person's soul goes on to the next world, and we should be aware of the fact that they're going to a better place, etc. And we spoke a lot, meaning maybe many people throw this around and they don't understand it. But I'm talking to a group of people who have been with me for 2 weeks, and you do understand what that means. So then what's going on here? Why don't we celebrate? So we'll start off by presenting 3 reasons from a Torah perspective why it is that we don't celebrate death, and we specifically are commanded, even if we're not interested in mourning, to mourn. Elise, can you do number 1 for us? Text 5a, reason number 1.
Okay. The Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to death, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and at their journeying away, even if they are alive.
Thank you, Elise. So reason number 1 is because it is natural. The fact of the matter is that even if it's the most amazing thing in the world, when we are separated from a loved one, there is natural anxiety, natural sadness. And we can all relate to this, even if you haven't lost a loved one. And I'm not comparing this to someone who's alive leaving for a long time, but think about, when you send a child off to college, most moms and dads are crying. And it's the most amazing thing in the world. They're saying that maybe they got into the best college that they can, and they're pursuing their life's dream, and it's every child's pride and joy to watch their children grow, etc. But the fact of the matter is that I'm not going to see my baby boy for 2 years or a year or even 6 months, right? And that's difficult. It's difficult for a parent to send their child off that way, right? And I know that many people, including some of you here on the Zoom, have children in college now, and maybe even longer now because of COVID. Many people are not traveling as much, so you go to college and they're staying there, and separation is difficult, even when people are alive. So because that's a natural thing that God put in us, we as Jews respect that. So even if the soul is going to the best place on earth, we still say it's natural to feel separation, for separation to cause sadness, and therefore we embrace that, and we not only allow for that to happen, but we encourage that. Reason number 2, Joanne, can you read for us, please? Text 5b.
Cathartic crying. Mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil, just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of lighthearted activity.
Thank you. So, you know how when someone is really, really happy, they dance, and they want to dance, and their joy exudes into the dancing. So there's something extremely cathartic about crying. When we allow ourselves to cry, right? This is very popular, by the way, in today's day and age. There's even therapies that encourage either laughter therapy or crying therapy, right? Just have a good cry, they say, and you'll let it out. It's a release. It's a, after you cry, a good cry, 10, 15, 20, 50 minutes, whatever it is, right? It's cathartic. And so this is, again, Maimonides, right? So the first one was Nachmanides, the Ramban. The second one is the Rambam. Maimonides telling us about, and this is not his halachic work. This is not his codifying of Jewish law work. This is his guide for the perplexed, much more philosophical. This is the second reason why we encourage mourning properly the deceased. And reason number 3 comes to us in text 5c. And Larry, I'll ask you if you can read it for us. And it comes to us from the Radvaz. So the Radvaz, or Rabbi David ibn Zimra, is a rabbi who lived right around the time of the Spanish Inquisition. You can read about him in the biography. And he belongs to a category of Jewish literature called Shut. Okay, Shut is an acronym, Shin Vav Taf, for Shalot Utshuvot, which means questions and answers. So till today, rabbis, especially not rabbis like myself, especially the greats, think about the chief rabbi of Israel or the chief rabbi of England, whatever it is, they're constantly answering questions. A new question comes up, and somebody will send them a question, they'll answer a question. And rabbis don't answer questions, especially not when they're not the ones that are compiled for literature with 1 or 2 or 5 word answers. Rather, they give them a full treatise, properly researched essay in response, right, as to what is the halachic and what is the Torah view based on the question you just asked. And here's all of the literature to back it up. I'm not saying my thoughts, but rather I'm backing it up with what's going on here. So someone asks the Radvaz a very interesting question. Larry, if you can read for us, please. Text 5C. We're on page 91.
Question. One of this generation's greatest personalities failed to shed a single tear upon losing a son. Is this a praiseworthy reaction? Answer. Such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers who maintain that this world is without purpose. By contrast, we have received the Torah, are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious, the prophets, the individuals renowned for their good deeds. It's not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, 30 for restrictions on wearing clothing and getting haircuts, etc. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her in Genesis 32, verse 2, and that Jacob, King David, and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise.
Thank you, Larry. Now, I just want to clarify something. Earlier in tonight's lesson, we mentioned that we should never be judging other people on how they grieve and what their reaction is, to loss. And that's still true. The Radvaz is taking a strong approach here to the philosophical argument that's being made by this great rabbi. If you know someone, I'm sure many of you do, because this is how they react, that when they lost a loved one, there was like an emotional freeze. Or maybe they're the kind of people that don't express their emotions publicly and they express them privately. That's fine. And those people should not be judged. And we should, come to them with compassion and help them through the grieving process. And sometimes it takes them time even to enter the grieving process, because it was, especially when it was a shock. However, here, it seems to be clear, especially from the Radvaz's answer, that this man was taking an approach that even if I want to cry, even if I want to grieve, the proper and elevated way of dealing with grief is, that's why the Radvaz compares him to the philosophers like Socrates, is to not allow myself to get emotionally involved. And that's where he says, no. We have an obligation to grieve. In fact, you can find it in the Torah, In fact, you can find it in the Torah over and over again that every single person, all the greats, whether it's Avraham Avinu or King David or whoever it is, they all grieved and they all allowed themselves to show that emotion and to have that emotion. And so this leaves us with 3 reasons that really give us 3 perspectives on why the Torah makes it now, number 1, natural to grieve. The Torah acknowledges that that's nature, human nature. Number 2, that there's actually benefits, it's actually beneficial for us to grieve. And number 3, the Torah says, and even if you maybe don't want to, we're going to make it obligatory. Why? Because by doing so, you reaffirm the Torah's value for life, as opposed to denying it, as the Radvaz accused this great leader, whoever it was, of doing. And so this leads us to the Jewish view of mourning. I think most of you are familiar with this. If you're not, we're going to go through it really quickly. I will mention that if you have recently lost a loved one and you're in the middle of these processes and you want a proper halachic overview, I would encourage you to get in touch either with myself or another rabbi to actually go through this properly. Here we're doing it just so that everybody has a background on it and we can begin to discuss it. So on page 93, we go through the Torah philosophy of grieving. It's all built on the same point. And that's what you have here on the screen in front of you. The purpose of all creation in this physical world and God's desire that we serve him has now come to a close. In other words, this person's part in that mission is now over. And that is a huge deal. And that's why we mourn. Now, it begins with a period called Aninut. Aninut is the time period from passing until interment. So that can be half a day, as we mentioned in previous classes, or that can sometimes be multiple days. And during that time, there's no consoling, there's no comforting mourners. In fact, the mourner is told not to even distract himself with mitzvahs. It's a time to grieve. It's still fresh. The wound is there. In Pirkei Avot, we have that in Ethics of Our Fathers, the Talmud tells us that you shouldn't attempt to grieve your friend when his dead is lying before him. It's not the time to do that. And of course, immediately upon hearing the news, the immediate family members tear, or at some point between not hearing the news or seeing the news and actual burial, at some point between those two, there is the tearing of an outer garment. And this shouldn't be, this really shouldn't be downplayed. I know in today's day and age, there are a lot of Jewish funeral homes even that try to replace this tradition with a black ribbon. We'll talk more about that soon, but there's a very strong significance to the physical tearing, the rendering of a garment. Anyways, after the 3 days of Aninut go by, did I skip a slide? Or they're in the wrong order or something? Okay. After the 3 days go by, we have Shiva. We're going to talk about Shiva momentarily. There's a separate figure for it. It's going to be on page 178, the 7 days. And we'll talk about a best kept secret that Shiva, even though it's called 7, is not really 7 days. It's really more like 4.5. And then goes Shloshim, which is for the first 30 days. This is beginning with burial until 30 days later. So that can be 34 days or whatever, what have you, after the person passed away. And some of the laws and traditions during this time are that we don't buy new clothing, we don't get a haircut, and we don't attend any festive events or hold any festive events. And then, of course, for the following 12 months, again beginning with burial, during this time, of course, we say Kaddish, but this is actually something that's only for a parent, which we'll talk about momentarily. That there are differences between if a person is mourning their child or if they're mourning a parent. It has a lot to do with the fact that we have a mitzvah, one of the 10 commandments, to honor our parents. As a result, we have an obligation to mourn for them even longer than we do for our children, or I mean, heaven forbid, not our, but that someone has to mourn for their children, etc. Some of the shloshim restrictions continue, like avoiding we don't attend weddings or hold weddings or that sort of thing. And it's customary to keep a candle burning for the entire 12 months. So that adds up to a lot of 7-day or 9-day candles. You know, the tall ones, you know, those that they sell.
Yeah.
Anyways, okay. All right. And this is the time that Judaism gives. Oh, and then, of course, from then on, we have Yartzeit. Each year on the passing, we say Kaddish. We add in Torah study and doing extra mitzvahs in their memory, which, again, we'll talk about much more about next week. Okay. Till now, we've been contrasting the Torah view of grieving or of bereavement with the ancient psychological view. Let's get a little more recent, okay? So up until the 1980s, psychologists were split into, for the most part, into 2 categories. One category, which we'll refer to as track 1, focused, and meaning this is how they gathered information about where the person was holding on in their grief, and this is how they attempted to assist with dealing with that grief. Everything was based around the person's function. Are they functioning? Have they gone back to work? If they're a parent, if there's someone that's relying on them to take care of them and help them through life, are they functioning in that way? Are they getting up every morning? How much are they sleeping? How much are they, everything was based around functioning. Track 2, and by the way, clinicians were completely split on this. Either they were completely in this camp or in the other camp. Track 2 looked at almost not at all at the person's functionality in society. They didn't care whether he was going to work. They didn't care whether she was actually mothering her children. Everything was based around the relationship that that person has or had and continues to have with the deceased. Right? So how close were they? What did they used to do together? And managing grief was all looked at through that lens. It took until 1981 that Dr. Simon or Shimshon Rubin, a Jewish Israeli psychologist who was at the University of Haifa, and he spent years studying grief. And in 1981, he finally published a first study that said, you know, maybe it's not track 1 or track 2. Maybe it's a combination of the two. And that's when he introduced the 2-track model of bereavement. And on page 94, you can see this in great detail. I'll give you guys a minute to do that. There's quite a bit there. And you see the 2 different tracks. And Dr. Rubin is the first one who said, you know, why are we only focusing on either on their engagement at work and maintaining relationships and other interests, or only on their connection with the deceased or their separation from the deceased, etc. Let's address both of them. And interestingly enough, in a paper, when was it? In 2014, Dr. Rubin actually published an article wherein he observes how the Jewish approach to mourning does tackle both of these. And you'll notice it in figure 3.4. You'll see how the Jewish perspective, which we just mentioned, is divided into 2, aninut and shiva. Aninut says, let's only focus on our relationship with the deceased. Now is not a time for functioning. In fact, you're actually absolved from all mitzvot of the Torah. I mean, there's no other time that we get that. Even on the night of your wedding, you're, for the most part, obligated in mitzvot, except for the Shema and this one and that, whatever, you know. But when a person has a loved one who passed away, the Jewish perspective is, now is a time, don't push it away. Now is a time to really focus on it. And that's what, okay. And then as we get into Shiva, so limited function is expected. You're now expected to daven. You're expected to do mitzvot, but you cannot go out into regular society. It's a time to have visitors come. And by the way, believe it or not, there are some people who look at this a little bit like a burden. Some people, after 3 days, they're done. And they're like, why do I have to continue to sit here and entertain all these visitors? I'm not interested in prolonging this. The Jewish perspective is that halachically, you are obligated, even if you don't want to do this. Process. Some people naturally process, and we need to tell them now's the time to stop processing. And some people are the opposite. They don't process unless they're told now is the time to process. And that's what Shiva is for. And then as we get into Shloshim and then into the 12 months and until Yartzeit, you know, we slowly encourage the mourner to come back into society more and more, begin to function more and more. Obviously, we still maintain that relationship with the deceased, eventually only on the Yartzeit or only when we visit, etc. But it's not a time to you know, it's not Eric couldn't have breakfast, why should I have breakfast? Eric can't have a birthday, why should I have a birthday? That's obviously unhealthy. I mentioned earlier that we're going to talk about tearing our garments. And text 6 is a very, very good example of that. And we'll use that to kind of spark our conversation on this. Laura Reutman, can I ask you to read for us text 6? This is Jacob hearing the news about Joseph, whom he thinks, passed away, right? Famously, because his brother sold him. They bring him back his colorful coat and it's soaked in blood. And let's see Jacob's reaction. Go ahead, text 6.
The brothers slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's tunic in its blood. They sent the colored tunic home, and the couriers brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please identify whether or not it is your son's tunic." Jacob recognized it and exclaimed, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Jacob rent his garments, placed sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son for many days.
This is the origin. Well, it's not the obligation, but this is the origin, the first time that we see someone tearing their clothing because someone passed away. And this is a very powerful, powerful tradition. I want to talk about why. There is something about doing something, and we're going to talk about this from 2 perspectives. But number 1, there's something about doing something physical that triggers the mourning. Very, very often, and I've seen this myself, people that just lost a loved one have a hard time entering that stage. They're still in shock. And the tearing of the garment, the tearing of something physical, really, there's something so real about it that really helps them enter that 7-day period. And that's why it's usually done right before the loved one is interred in the ground, because that's when the shiva is now expected to begin. And we want to help them enter that stage. Again, it's not easy to do this. It's not easy to cry, but it's important for us, as we mentioned earlier, many reasons of why it's important to mourn and grieve properly, and this really triggers that. In text 7, another shut, another responsa, Rabbi Yehuda Ayash shares this perspective. Laura Batat, can I ask you please to read this for us? Text 7.
Rabbi Yaakov Hagi states in Halacha Ketanot, chapter 116, that mourners are instructed to render their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing their overwhelming grief. In my humble opinion, the opposite is true. Having to rend their garments brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience their tremendous loss.
So he's pointing out that there was obviously another perspective that rendering a garment was supposed to be a distraction. He's pointing out, no. There's something extremely visceral about doing that not only doesn't distract them, but it actually kind of pushes them in. You know what I mean? I don't know how many of you have been skydiving, and I haven't been, but I'd imagine that it's similar to kind of, being on the top of that airplane, and all of a sudden, even though the person chose to go skydiving, so, and there's just something about jumping out that you need that help. And very often the instructors push people out because they just can't bring themselves to jump out on their own. I mean, nobody likes crying. Nobody likes mourning or grieving, etc. Nobody wants it. We should all only grieve at the right time when our loved ones pass away at a ripe old age and in a calm and smooth fashion. But when that time comes, sometimes we need that push. We need that to get us into it. And that's one of the reasons why we do that. There is another perspective. Hold on. I thought there's a text on this. Hold on. It might be an appendix. Where did I see another text in this? Hold on just 1 second. I don't have a note here to go to an appendix. So let's leave it for now. We will get another reason why, but for now, let's leave it as is. Okay, let's move on to finding comfort. So of course, it's very nice again for us to sit here and say that at some point we have to exit the mourning stage and it's time for us to enter reality again and return to regular life, etc. But that's something that's very, very difficult to do. The return is of course meant to be in phases, and that's where text 8 comes in. Who are we holding here? Margaret, Simcha Bracha, can you read for us, please? Text 8.
Definitely.
Go for it. Page 99.
Page 99, text 8. Neither cry for the dead, nor bemoan him. Jeremiah 22:10. Neither cry for the dead more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. How are we expected to act? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogies, and 30 days for restriction on new clothing and haircuts. Once this have elapsed, God declares, you are not more compassionate than I.
Thank you.
Wow.
So the Talmud quotes a statement. The Talmud quotes a pasuk, a verse from Jeremiah, where the Torah tells us, neither cry for the dead nor bemoan him. What do you mean, neither cry for him nor bemoan him? So he says, listen, don't do more than necessary. Don't enter chronic grief. 3 days, 7 days, 30 days, that's your window to kind of slowly get out of it. If you're crying, if you're over grieving, that's when Hashem says, you are not more compassionate than I. You're beginning to deny the existence of God by saying, oh, this wasn't supposed to happen, and I'm going to continue to ask why and moan and groan and grieve even forever because God was wrong by doing this, or God doesn't exist and therefore this happened. And the obvious question is how, right? How do we go about that? So for this, I'm going to turn to you guys, if you don't mind. I mean, we have a lot to share here in the book, but I'd love to hear your ideas based on all the philosophical things that we mentioned. And you can type them in the chat, please, because I'd love to hear a lot of ideas. So the more people, the better. Type whatever comes to your mind. We've now done 2.5 lessons of this course. We've discussed a lot of philosophical ideas. What are some ideas that can help someone who's mourning be comforted and move back into regular life, or begin to gradually go back into regular life? Please type it in the chat. We have 25 people on here. Let's get some movement here.
What's the question?
I didn't say I wasn't going to make you work. I said, in your opinion, based on everything we learned, what are some good ways to things that people can keep in mind to help them be comforted and move back into regular life? Oh, thank you, Esther. Yes, that he or she is still here. And she puts that in air quotes. In other words, the eternal nature of the soul and the fact that we still have a relationship with that person. Writing down memories of your loved one. Again, that same idea. Thank you, Sheila. So remembering that relationship continues. Yes, absolutely. That's a good way. What other things can we do that can help us be comforted and move past mourning into regular life? Here's another one that came in. Think of how the deceased would want you to live your life and not be sad for so long. That's true. That's especially true of when parents or those that are older than us pass away, 100%. Encourage the mourner to talk about their loved one. Yes, that might be a good thing to do. Ask God for comfort, adopting that person's good qualities. Yes, creating a legacy out of them, perpetuating their good deeds, 100%. Doing mitzvahs in their memory. That's a big one. And that's something we're going to talk about next week. Great points. In text 9a, we're going to move past all those points and specifically to hold on. Here's a couple more. So I asked everybody for them, so I need to read them all out loud. Saying Kaddish regularly, yes, that's very important. Rendering is physical release at the grave site. Sitting shiva helps the person with grief. Very good. That's a good way to transition. Not letting go is obsessive, which is not good, right? So we need to learn to let go. I guess, Arnold, the question is, how can we let go? What can we do to help us let go? Right? So like some people mentioned, remembering the eternal nature of the soul is a good way to slowly, the more we think about that, the more we can begin to let go. Obviously, a lot of it is going to be time, right? For most people, naturally, time helps with that. In text 9a, we have the traditional, and I'm sure a lot of you are curious about this. This is very perplexing to a lot of people. And I've had this question in shiva houses, believe it or not. Whenever we visit a shiva house, the traditional Jewish kind of greeting, or greeting is a interesting way to put this, but the traditional Jewish text to comfort the mourners is Hamakom Yenachem Eschem Besoch She'ar Avele Zion V'Yerushalayim. May the omnipresent God console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And this is a very, very interesting text. Why? Number one, the first and foremost thing we do is we mention God. Somebody mentioned in the chat about this. There is nobody that can console you more than God, and we are giving you our blessing that God should console you. However, have you ever noticed part two? That we compare this person's grieving to the grieving that we collectively as Jewish people do for Jerusalem. And text 9b illustrates this point beautifully. This is a letter that the Rebbe wrote to, at the time he wasn't prime minister, at the time he was an IDF general, Ariel Sharon, in the fall of 1967, following the tragic passing of his young son. His son's name was Gur. We're gonna read a couple of excerpts from that letter, by the way. Today we'll read just this one, 9b. I'm not sure where we're holding here. Carol, can you read for us, please, text 9b?
In regard to Zion and Jerusalem, the Romans and before them the Babylonians were given dominion only over the wood and stone, silver and gold of the temple's physical manifestation, but not over its inner spiritual essence, contained within the heart of each and every Jew. Over this, the nations have no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, death dominates only the physical body and concerns of the deceased person. The soul, however, is eternal. It has merely ascended to the world of truth.
Thank you, Carol. And I see that some people are asking questions. We'll make some time for questions in just a moment. The Rebbe is pointing out to then IDF General Ariel Sharon that something that we learned over the past 2 weeks, that the soul is eternal, and that the reason why we say, may God comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, is because just like Zion was only a physical destruction, just like when the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, was destroyed, Yerushalayim was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed and conquered by the Romans or the Babylonians or whoever it was only a physical destruction, but not a spiritual destruction. And there was no way they could ever take away the holiness that there was in the space of the temple. Similarly, when a person passes away, they are only physically absent. Sorry, where were we? Here we are. But spiritually, they are immortal. This is a very powerful point, but very philosophical. And I think this is a great time. I was so happy when I saw that for this lesson, this is where they put this. This is a great time for another meditation with Rabbi Shais Taub to try to internalize this idea, right? Pretend you're a mourner, and I know many of you have experienced this in the past, and you're using this physical and historical analogy to get on board with the fact, right? Not just to understand it, but to actually relate with and live with the idea that the soul is eternal and it's just the physical body that can be destroyed. Please turn your attention to the video screens. I do believe that I need to share it again, like that we get the sound. Hold on.
Today's reflection is going to involve an image which all of us probably have an immediate and strong reaction to. It is an icon for Jewish people all over the world and throughout the ages. An image that when we see it, we have a very strong and almost reflex response. I'm speaking of the image of the Western Wall, the only remaining vestige of the once glorious Holy Temple which stood in Jerusalem and was destroyed 2,000 years ago. We're going to use this image to help us in relating to our understanding of our relationship with those who have passed on. So imagine, if you will, in your mind's eye, the image of the temple, the glorious temple as it stood, as it was built by Solomon in its royal splendor, something that was revered by peoples all over the world. And now, juxtapose that glorious image with the image of the Western Wall as it stands now and has stood for 2,000 years in its destroyed state. Go back and forth between these two images. The temple as it stood in its glory, and the temple in ruins when we only have the Western Wall. The Western Wall is a symbol of destruction. The temple is no more. And yet, think about the hope, the strength, the inspiration the spiritual and emotional energy that emanates from that image, even when the temple is in its destroyed state. Now think about a loved one who has passed on. Think about them when they were here with us in the physical world. Think about the situation at present when their physical body is no more. Are they really gone? Have they really lost their influence and power in your life? Or are they like the Western Wall? The Western Wall is an image of destruction, and yet the Western Wall is a symbol of inspiration and hope, pride, powerful, powerful emotions. Think of this image. Think of the feelings that it evokes in you. And now relate this as a symbol to those who are currently, physically, their vessel has been destroyed, but spiritually, their power is as great as ever. We'll take a moment now to reflect and to connect to this image and to relate it to our loved ones.
And this brings us to the second reason why it is that we rend our garments. Marilyn, if I can ask you to read for us text 10, which is an article specifically about why we tear our garments. What's the symbolism there?
Garment, a metaphor for the body. Often within their pain, the mourners have an underlying belief that it isn't true, that their loved one hasn't really gone. This is not just denial. In a way, they are right. Death is not an absolute reality. The souls existed before we were born, and they continue to exist after we die. The souls that have passed on are still with us. We can't see them, but we sense they are there. We can't hear them, but we know that they hear us. On the surface, we are apart. Beyond the surface, nothing can separate us. So we tear our garments. This has a dual symbolism. We are recognizing the loss, that our hearts are torn, but ultimately the body is also only a garment that the soul wears. Death is when we strip off one uniform and take on another. The garment may be torn, but the essence of the person within is still intact. From our worldly perspective, death is indeed a tragedy, and the sorrow experienced by the mourners is real. But as they tear their garments, we hope that within their pain, they can sense a glimmer of a deeper truth, that souls never die.
Thank you, Marilyn. And this brings us to the end of the Jewish perspective on how we transition. Some of the ideas that we think about, some of the things that we do, the physical actions that we do, like rending garments, and the verbal things that we do, like those that share with us if we are grieving, about the destruction of Jerusalem, which seems completely random, right? All of these things are meant to help the mourner transition from regular life, from grieving and from a state of grief slowly into regular life. Ideally, this should take 3 days, 7 days, 30 days, 12 months, and then once a year. And that's a general parameter. You know, obviously some people 3 days is 5 days, or 3 days is 1 day. whatever it is. But this is the general perspective. The Torah tells us that these are the stages we need to go through. Section 5, Healing Truths, which is on page 103, we are going to go through fairly quickly. I want to make one introduction. Okay, we're going to deal with chronic grief, okay, or complicated grief. Different, descriptions, psychological descriptions that there are. Unhealthy grieving, when a person seems stuck. What are some things, some Torah perspectives, when a person seems stuck? Whether it's us that seems that way, or if we know a loved one that's dealing with someone that passed, or we know a friend that's dealing with a loved one that passed away. Usually, and again, like I say, this is not going to be a be all end all. This is just going to be two Torah perspectives. In fact, usually, what happened here? Yeah, there we go. Sorry. Right, we did that. Usually, these things are based on a variety of different things. There's so many different things that people get stuck on that's what causes them chronic grief. We're just going to deal with two of them today, okay? And the Torah definitely has perspectives on all of them, but today we'll just do two of them, okay? So in general, common emotional reactions that cause someone to get stuck in grief are injustice. That's the why, right? This is very common. If it was a child, if it was suicide, if it was, or if it was murder, certainly, or an accident, right? A tragic motor vehicle accident, or something like this. Or a horrific illness that took them at a young age, right? Injustice. Why? Guilt. Why do I get to live while that person doesn't? Depression, sadness, anger, denial. These are all different things that we can do. Today, we're only going to deal with two of them, and I'm going to try to do them quickly. I know we're not going to do justice to them, so we're going to try to do as much as we can. The first one we're going to deal with is anger and injustice. And we're going to do, so we're going to do anger and injustice, and then we'll do guilt, okay? So the first one, which is anger and injustice, for that one, we're going to turn to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, very, very famous rabbi, actually the rabbi who helped the Jewish people through the destruction of the Second Temple. We are not going to read the entire text 11. I will summarize it for you. And then I will ask Mickey if you can please read for us the last part of it. So the beginning, what happens is as follows. So Yochanan ben Zakkai tragically lost his son at a very young age. Okay. Now Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had many students, 5 kind of primary students, the students. For those of you that are familiar with some of the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he snuck outside of Jerusalem's walls during the siege, there were 5 students that carried him and they had to pretend like he was dead for his funeral. These are the 5 students we're talking about. Pirkei Avot tells us about them, etc. And these 5 students come in to console him one at a time. The first person to come in, and you can follow along with me if you'd like in the text. The first one to come in is Rabbi Eliezer. He asks his teacher if he can speak. His teacher says yes. He says, how can you still be mourning? Remember, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is stuck in grief. This is way beyond Shiva, Shloshim. We're not told when it is, but it's beyond the normal amount. Rabbi Eliezer says to him, how can you continue to grieve? Even Adam allowed himself to be consoled after Cain killed Abel. and he brings a verse to back himself up. And Rabbi Yochanan says, is it not enough that I'm grieving my own loss? I also have to grieve for Adam? And he refused to be consoled. Rabbi Yoshua enters, the second student, similar approach. He says, can I share something? Sure. How can you grieve when Job, had many sons and daughters? They all died, and yet he allowed himself to be comforted. And Rabbi Yochanan says, is it not enough that I'm grieving for my own son, that I also need to grieve for Eov? You see the pattern. Rabbi Yossi says, how can you grieve when even Aaron, who had 2 sons who were, right, Nadav and Avihu, who died with their whole story? And Rabbi Yochanan says, is it not, and he allowed himself to be comforted. And again, he brings a verse to back it up. And Rabbi Yochanan says, is it not enough that I'm grieving my own loss? I have to also grieve for Aaron. Rabbi Shimon says, King David had a son who died. And again, he's comforted. Rabbi Yochanan says, is it not enough that I am grieving for my own son? Do I also need to grieve for King David's? And then look what happens when Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch begins to enter the room. On page, I actually don't know the page, but towards the end of text 11, Mickey, if I can ask you to read from Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch.
Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch entered. When Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he told his attendant, grab a set of clothing for me and be prepared to follow me to the bathhouse. For Rabbi Elazar is a great person, and I will not be able to hold out in the face of his comforting words. Rabbi Elazar entered, sat before Rabbi Yochanan, and told him, "Let me share a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Each day the man would weep and wail in fear. Woe is me, when will I emerge unharmed from this safekeeping role? You, master, also had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, the prophets, and scriptures, in the Mishnah, the Halacha, and the exegetical teachings, and he passed from this world without sin. You should certainly accept consolation, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition." Rabbi Yochanan responded, "Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion."
Thank you, Mickey. So look how the mood changes as soon as Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch walks in. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's still stuck in grief, right, and who hasn't showered and hasn't gone to the bathhouse, etc., and hasn't been functioning, like the psychologist would say, right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, prepare. This is going to be the end of it. Whatever he's going to tell me, I know he's going to get me out of it, and indeed he does. What does Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch tell him? Why are these words so comforting for him? Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch recognizes that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is stuck with anger and injustice. I would say more injustice than anger. He's stuck with the why question, right? Why him? Why so early? Why did he have to pass away? Why couldn't it be me? We don't know exactly what the questions that he was asking was. And Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch delivers a truth, a powerful truth. He says, I'm not going to add more pain to your suffering. Excuse me. I'm not going to tell you that you should copy someone else or you should be like someone else. Why are you grieving? I'm not going to ask you why you're grieving. Of course you're grieving. You're in a terrible situation. I'm going to deliver a truth and remind you of something that you already know. And that is two things. That is twofold. Number one, that life is a deposit. Right? So the first thing that Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch does is he walks in and he acknowledges Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's feelings. Right? He says, you should be grieving. I understand that you feel that this is unjust. And at the same time, he offers him a path. How can you get out of this? And he delivers those two truths. Truth number one that he delivers is that life is a deposit. We've learned this already before philosophically. But here, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch delivers it beautifully in comforting words. He says to him, your son was never your own son. For those of you that attended one of the Wine and Wisdoms was about parenting, right? One of the best pieces of parenting advice you can give someone is that they should remember that it's not their own child, it's God's child, right? This son that you had was a deposit that was given to you, and now Hashem took it back. And how proud should you be that he lived a good life and that you took perfect care of him and that he learned Torah and that he had a good life. So yes, he went at a young age. This is when Hashem wanted him to go, and you gave your deposit back in perfect condition. Compare that with other people who give their deposits back, with all sorts of blemishes. I guess the comparing to other people is not the main point. The point is to focus on his. And number two is he says, remember that his life has a mission, right? There was something that his soul was sent down here in this world to do, and that time finished. There's no such thing as a soul being taken early. The question, why so early, is not valid. He left at the exact right time. And these two things are ultimately what comforted Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The second emotional response that sometimes gets people stuck in grieving that we're going to deal with today is guilt. And guilt is usually built around a couple of simple things, simple for us to talk about at least, very, very complex for people to get over. Unfortunately, while people are alive, don't necessarily have the best relationship with them, right? They may have said something wrong to their father. They may have never apologized to their mother for something specific. They may have always wanted to develop a deeper relationship with their child, and then the child is ripped from this world. And they're stuck with feelings of guilt. I wanted to be able to continue that relationship. Why is this relationship being taken away from me that I cannot have that anymore? To this, the most powerful words that we can give are obviously everything we've learned about the continuing relationship with those that have passed. Where are we here? Stephanie, can you read for us, please? Text 12. Text 12 is from Reb Aaron Karliner, and he shares with us some very, very physical imagery about the continuing relationship that we have with the departed. Go ahead, text 12.
When children say the Kaddish for their parents, it is like sending them regards. When they learn a chapter in the Mishnah on their behalf, it is like sending them a letter. And when they fulfill mitzvahs and good deeds for the benefit of their souls, it is like sending them the entire parcel.
Thank you, Stephanie. And so if someone is stuck with this guilt and worried that the relationship is done, it's so final, and I have so many things I want to say to them, etc., we can remind them, or we can remind ourselves, that we have so many ways to continue that relationship, whether it's through Kaddish, which is davening, whether it's through Mishnah, which is learning, or whether it's through mitzvahs, right? The world stands on three pillars, right? On Torah study, on prayer, and on mitzvahs. And through these three ways, there are very specific mechanisms, right? Kaddish is a specific way of giving regards, having a verbal communication with our loved ones. Learning a Mishnah is a very powerful thing. The word Mishnah actually has the same letters as neshama. And that's how we can send a letter to our loved one. And doing a mitzvah is like sending a parcel to them, a complete parcel to them. And let's leave that as it is for now. We're going to talk a lot more about that next week. Some of the things that we do to memorialize and in memory and in honor of our loved ones, etc., and how that works and what that accomplishes. I want to conclude today's lesson. We're running a little bit late, maybe 10, 15 minutes, with talking about the Shiva house. So on page 15, again, this is not a halachic forum. So if any of you are in need of guidance in this regard, of exact guidance, exactly what a Shiva house should look like, I encourage you to call me when that time comes, or to call whichever rabbi. But in figure 3.5, we get basic Shiva protocol. Mirrors and pictures in the Shiva house are covered. We have this on the screen here. Hold on, I can pull this up as well. Oh, whoops. Yes, I apologize. So before we get into, see, it's good that I pulled up the PowerPoint, because I forgot we were supposed to open up with the video. Before we start talking about the Shiva house, we have a very interesting video to show here, and I'm very excited to show it for a few reasons. So in this video, we're going to see a doctor, a rabbi, and I think it's a psychologist, all reacting. Well, not reacting, but talking to us about their Shiva experience and what they found comforting during mourning. The reason I'm excited to show this video to you is because, to me, this is a very personal video. Two out of the three people that they chose to interview happen to be people that I'm close with. One of them is a man 4 years my senior, who was in yeshiva with me. I was actually just messaging back and forth with him today, Rabbi Loshak. He's the rabbi. And then there is Mrs. Branya Schaefer, whose husband, actually, before he passed away at a very young age, was partners with my father. And I was actually just talking today with a third partner. I didn't do this on purpose. There are three partners in a particular business venture that my father has till today for the past 30 years, 36 years, I think, that he's been in this particular business venture. And of the three partners, one of them passed away, and that's Gedalia Schaefer. So it's his wife that's talking here. So please turn your attention to the video screens as we see some perspectives on the Shiva from a traditional perspective.
When a loved one passes away, Jewish law calls upon the immediate family to experience the rite of Shiva. Approximately 7 days are spent in mourning and receiving comfort from visitors. A doctor, a rabbi, and an acclaimed lecturer offer personal reflections on the rite of Shiva.
When someone dies, the relationship with the deceased doesn't end. The relationship with the person who died continues. It just changes from a face-to-face interpersonal relationship to a relationship of memories, to a relationship of legacies. By engaging the mourners in this process, you're helping them make that shift.
The purpose of Shiva is meant for the mourner to be able to take that time aside from the affairs of life and affairs of the world, to contemplate, to introspect, and to share with others the life they had, with the person they loved. People come to visit and console and try to bring comfort to the mourner.
The structure of it and the formality of it, it gives a sense of relief. You know, when you're grieving, it's very all over the place, very hard to contain. And the structure of the Shiva brings a relief and a sense of conformity, which is quite redeeming.
If you want to help comfort the griever, what you're in essence doing by taking an interest in the person who's died is helping that person preserve his life.
I remember hearing people say things to me that was almost like they said it and the words stopped right here. But days and weeks and months later, they slowly made their way in.
The point of the Shiva is not to come up with anything brilliantly comforting to say, because there really isn't anything to say. Rather, it's just simply to be there.
One person who lost a toddler under very, very tragic circumstances told me what was the most comforting visit all week. And I'll say it the way he said it. He said an older gentleman with a lot of life experience came in. He said he sat in front of him and he asked to see a picture of his daughter. He gave him the picture. He looked at the picture. He cried for 10 minutes straight. He gave the picture back. He said the traditional verse that you say as you leave, and that was it. And he said that was, without a doubt, the most comforting visit.
But in retrospect, I have to say that that week of the passage between one reality and the next reality, somehow I have to believe in His infinite wisdom, God saw to it that this passage not be taken alone, even while feeling lonely.
Take on a mitzvah. Do something, and it can be tiny, but I'm going to do it in memory of this person, and especially if it fits with that person. That's comforting. Now the world's a slightly better place because of that person.
You know, halacha, Jewish law, is a very interesting thing. And a lot of people often ask me, they're like, you know, I don't understand. Why are there these laws of what we should do? Shouldn't they be more like suggestions, you know, good ideas? Like, if you're in the mood, put on tefillin and meditate on you know, the oneness of God. If you feel like it, light some candles and bring in the Shabbat into your home. Like, why are they? And that would also be a nice way of doing it, right? Guidance, Jewish guidance. What's with all the laws, right? Often you get this from people who want to know why Judaism is so restrictive, so to speak. Very often, the laws are in place because it's hard for us to get into that mode and to do it. And we need some rigid framework that we can then fill with our own emotions and with our own feeling, with our own meaning. And that's what halacha provides. When it comes to Shiva, and again, like I mentioned, we say it's 7 days, but actually the day that the person passed away, the day that the person is buried, the day that the person is buried, excuse me, the day that the person, I'm just looking at some questions that are coming in, I'm going to address them in a moment. The day that the person is buried, that's the day that the Shiva begins. And that day is day number 1. And since burial usually takes time and the levaya or the funeral takes time, so you're usually looking at a couple hours that day. The last day of day number 7, actually that's day number 1. Day number 7, we only sit for 1 hour. Then in the middle, we have Shabbos when we're not supposed to mourn. So it's included in that week-long period. So it's really only like 4.5 days. But during that 7-day period, we cover the mirrors in the house. We remain in the house of mourning. We continue wearing the same garment that was torn the entire time. We sit on low chairs. We forego the comfort of leather footwear. We shun shaving and haircuts. We refrain from marital intimacy. We don't listen to music. We don't go to business. We don't work. We don't even study Torah, by the way. I gave someone a book, actually, of the Rebbe's wisdom on healing. Here, I have one here. If anybody wants one, I'm happy to share it. A Time to Heal. This is some of the Rebbe's wisdom on how, what, comforting words from the Rebbe. And he actually asked me, I remember I gave it to him at the funeral, and I said, I think you'll find this very comforting over the course of the next 7 days. And he told me, but I thought I'm not allowed to study Torah. And obviously we're allowed to study things that help us through the grieving period. But just studying Torah, opening up the Talmud, opening up Chassidus and just studying, not allowed. Showers and bathing. We daven in the home. We don't even go out to daven in shul. And then we entertain visitors. We have visitors coming. And someone asked, how can we do this during COVID? And obviously things change. And if the person has the ability to have people come in, like if they're not too elderly and too vulnerable, etc., they should have people come in with masks and with social distancing, etc. And if they cannot, then it should be via Zoom. But it definitely needs to be there. There needs to be that time. By the way, this has been very difficult for many people during COVID, especially during the beginning of COVID, when we really weren't sure what was going on and had to take precautions. It was very, very difficult. People were losing people to COVID and mourning in solitude. And we saw starkly the reason why the Torah gives us these things. But perhaps so text 13, we have the mitzvah from Maimonides. I'll read it. The sages obligated us to visit the sick and console mourners. These are deeds of kindness that one carries out in person and have no limit, because we receive no reciprocation. We get nothing back from that. There's no limit to how much we can how much we can comfort them. The more we're there, the more comforted they feel, etc. And although these are rabbinic ordinances, they fall into the purview of the biblical commandment to love your fellow as yourself. So all of this comforting falls under v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. In other words, part of the mitzvah of to love your fellow as yourself. But my favorite is text 14, because there's a lot of big no-nos that persons shouldn't do in a house of shiva and faux pas, and I'm sure we've all been there and seen somebody say something that was completely inappropriate, or the opposite, someone doesn't say anything, etc. But text 14, the Talmud says, Agra de beitam yashtikusa. The reward for visiting the home of mourning is for the silence, like Rabbi Loshak shared. Just being there for the person is such a powerful thing. Just the person knowing, like Mrs. Schaefer shared, that they're going through this and they might feel lonely, but that they're not going through it alone, that is extremely comforting for people that are mourning and that are trying to transition back into regular life slowly. And this is why one of the laws about the house of mourning, Steve, if we can ask you to read text 15.
Okay. The comforters may not say anything until the mourner opens the conversation.
It's important that that person allow you in, and then you start to talk. It's important that we don't philosophize. We don't sit there and give them reasons why somebody passed away, right? We don't ask them like, were you there when they passed away? How painful was it? Did they die from cancer, or was it from the chemo? Medical malpractice, there was or there wasn't. We're not looking to give them justifications. Nothing you say is going to bring the person back from the dead. That's why it's so important to weigh every single word and to focus much more, if you are going to say anything, to focus much more on the positive impacts, to talk about the deceased person and their legacy, whether it's crying with them by looking at a picture, or whether it's, once the mourner opens the conversation, to start to talk, here it is, to direct the grief from just depression to mourning, being sad over something that was good, that was here, someone that we loved, that did so many good things for us, a relationship that we had with them, helping that person work through that mourning and moving into a legacy and things that we're going to do, a mitzvah that I'm going to do in their memory, continue their good life that they had here in this world. And text 16 is such an amazing text to end on. Joanne, if I can ask you to read it for us, please. Text 16 is from the Medrash, which talks about God's reaction. Joanne? I don't know if she's available. So Larry, if you can please, text 16. Go for it.
Okay, The final word regarding a person is that of the people proclaiming his deeds. Commenting, so-and-so is upright, so-and-so is God-fearing. When a person departs the world, God says to the ministering angels, see what people are saying about him. If they say that he'd been upright and God-fearing, his soul immediately ascends to paradise.
Thank you. So it turns out that our words are not only powerful when it comes to comforting the mourners, but they're also powerful when it comes to actually assisting the soul in moving on to its next stage.
Lesson 3, the mourning after. 1. Everyone reacts to and deals with grief differently. No two people are psychologically alike, and no two circumstances of death and bereavement are the same. 2. It is a mitzvah to mourn the loss of a loved one. Processing a loss is critical to the healing process, and this is accomplished by shiva, a mandatory period of grieving. 3. The Torah validates and encourages mourning, but only for a prescribed period of time, after which the mourner is enjoined to transition back to normal life. 4. Some ideas that give a mourner the strength to move on. A. The knowledge that the soul lives on and is not diminished by death. B. It is never too late to mend or improve our relationship with the deceased. Though our physical relationship has ended, we can still give him or her spiritual gifts. C. Life is a deposit, and God decides when to give it and when it must be returned. D. For this soul and its unique mission, this constituted a full life. 5. It is a mitzvah to comfort mourners. The most basic principle of comforting a mourner is simply being there. Our presence offers comfort and lessens the loneliness that often accompanies mourning.
And with this, we conclude lesson 3 of Journey of the Soul, the morning after. And I encourage you all to join us for lesson 4 next week when we talk about where we go.